Brilliant. Well, I wanted to carry on in this building series, this series called Build. I wanted to carry on with that today because I feel like we're in this season of preparation, and this is a picture of my house where we did some renovation in lockdown. We extended the back, and the thing is with building is it can be very messy, and we've been looking at these last few weeks at building us, so us as people. We did that 1 week, and then we did building family, that was a couple of weeks ago. And then today I want to look at building church as well. And next week he's building his mission. Is another photograph there of the build? Yeah. So this was us in the middle of all the mess. This is Charlie the dog thinking, what is going on here in my house? But the truth is, when God is doing something new, and I believe he is doing something new, that very often in order to get to the new thing that God is doing, it means that we have to wade through the messy middle of it all. In Isaiah 43 it says, forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up, do you not perceive it, do you not see it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. I do believe that God is doing a new thing, and in a time of rebuilding, which is the season that we feel we've been in, you always need an architect. I was glad that we could call on an architect, and an architect just asks you lots of questions about the build and you know what you want to achieve. And I believe that actually that we're in I suppose an era. It's not really a season we're in an era right now where people are asking a lot of questions. And when I think about the wider context of church, you know, church leaders they're asking a lot of questions, and they're looking for answers to those questions, you know, because people are saying, well, what kind of church should we be now, you know, post-COVID, and what kind of church will you be? But we live in a world and in an era right now where there's this polarisation that's happening. You know, you see it a lot in America, really. It's like Democrats, Republicans. You know, you'll remember the Black Lives Matter movement. Are you Black Lives Matter, or are you All Lives Matter? And these really controversial and provoking, divisive topics that lead to these kind of two places of polarisation. And you can see it happening sometimes in the church as well, you know, and people try and polarise, you know, so the way that you're going to build now. Are you going to be a seeker-friendly church? Or are you going to be one of those Holy Spirit-filled kind of radical churches? And I want to say, what about we could be both and? What if we could wade into some kind of messy middle? Because when we think of some of these areas of polarisations of thoughts in our world, like actually people want you to take a camp, don't they? It's like, are you this side or are you that side? And in leadership, you know, some people will say, well, I'm only for men in leadership. And then other people will be like, well, what would you do without the women? I believe in women in leadership. What about both and? What about leadership where actually men and women can work together, be co-partners for the gospel together? What about that as a way, rather than getting ourselves into camps? Some churches might say, well, I'm going to be a youth church. It's all about the youth. We need to reach the next generation. The stats are terrifying. We need to go down that direction. But you know, what about the God that we serve, that is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of every generation? And then some churches post-COVID, they're saying, well, I think there should be an internet church. We need to get with it now. We need to realise the world has changed and adapted, and we just need to be online now. And then you have a church over here going, well, we're the real deal over here. We meet in person. And that's how it should be done. That's how it's always been done. But is there a hybrid? Is there a both and? And I just think we're living in interesting times where the world would want to polarise us, put us in this camp or this camp. The world would want to see us divided, but actually God has promised us doors of opportunity. He's promised us keys to the kingdom, and he's asked us to be carriers of hope. So if ever there was a season where we needed to be unified and we needed to wade through the messy middle of building, it's now. It's being unified, and it's now. I believe that as a church we need to be the first responders of hope. And you know, when we move into the new building, that is what I'm most excited about, actually, is that we will be a visible presence in the community where we will be able to be, I mean, it says it in our name, but we will be able to be the first responders of hope to those who need it. And a pastor from up north that I follow, he's led a big church up in the north of England. And he's been a leader for a lot longer than I have. He's been around a lot longer than I have as well. He's much older than me. And he said in the 1960s, when we look back at the 1960s and the church, we called that the decade of harvest. That was what people talked about in the 60s. In the 70s, it was a decade of praise. People got their guitars out, mission praise books were printed in their masses, Spring Harvest and places like that. People just found this new love of worship and modern songs. And then in the 80s, it was a decade of healing. So it's like, I've not just saved you, I've not just come to save you, but I've come to heal you. In the 90s, it was a decade of prosperity and blessing. It was, people were talking about the prosperity gospel, and that there was a blessing to live in your life according to the gospel. And then in the early 2000s, this was a decade of leadership. Like, everyone had the latest John Maxwell book, and pastors were looking at how they could lead their congregations well. And then in 2010, it was a decade of multi-site, where churches were saying, how can we duplicate what we have, or multiply what we have? And people were looking to have multiple locations. And then it made me laugh, because I was like, right, okay, so this is the decade I'm leading in. 2020, he said, this is where we see a migration on the landscape. The landscape is mixing up, messing up, and mashing up, but for a better tomorrow. So this is a decade of shaking, where things that can be shaken will be. But actually in the shaking, those things that can't be shaken will be stronger. And I am so grateful that we serve Jesus, who is not shaken by any of these things. He sits on the throne. He is above all these things. He's not shivering his boots thinking, what's going to happen next? Oh dear, what shall I do? The God that we serve, he has a plan. And as we heard those lyrics in that song, this is the God who has always been and always will be. He is all powerful. And but the thing is, the psalmist in Psalm 62, he's saying that this God who is all powerful, the one who cannot be shaken, is one that calls us to be a people who are not shaken by what we see. And so in Psalm 62, verse 6, it says, He alone is my rock and my salvation, my stronghold. I will not be shaken. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my high tower. I shall not be moved. God is a high tower. And when we know that we have a refuge that we can run to, we as people can find security in that, where we are not moved, where we are not shaken, because we find refuge in a God who is not shaken, that he is a strong tower, as the Bible says, that the righteous can run into. Now, when we're talking about building a church, of course, we're not talking about a building. I don't want us to get confused with the fact that we're renovating a building. Of course, we're talking about the people. And in 1 Corinthians 3, verse 10 and onwards, it says, By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as a wise builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should build with care. For no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If anyone builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, their work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. So what is Paul saying here? He's saying that a building, a life, a person is only as strong as the foundation that they build on. And Paul is describing himself here in verse 10 as a master builder, a wise builder who has laid this foundation, which is Jesus Christ. And now he's looking for others who are going to build on that foundation. But what he says here in verse 10, he says, "For each one should build with care." It's like a warning here that Paul is laying out for us, that we need to take care with our attitude. We need to take care with what we value as important. We need to take care with how we spend our time, take care with what we read, what we watch, take care with what we fill our minds with, take care with the people that we hang out with the words that we speak. Because you see, to build a church or to build a life that is going to stand the test of time, that is going to be strong, that is not going to be flattened when the storms come, needs to be built on nothing else other than Jesus Christ. You know, there's in Matthew 7, there's a very famous story about a man who built his house upon the sand. And when the storms came, that house could not withstand the storm. But the one who built on a rock, that was the one that stood. That was the one that was strong. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to build my life like it's a sandcastle. Like, you know, if you build sandcastles on the beach with your kids, you know, you build them, and they don't last long, do they? Like, the tide comes in, easily takes it away. Sometimes another child will come running across the beach, and then the thing that you poured hours over in building is quickly squashed. So, in this kind of preparation season, I thought, as Paul says here, take care in how you build on that foundation of Jesus Christ. And so we, a number of years ago, the leadership team, it's actually a previous leadership team to the one we currently have, they put together some kind of take care stones, I would say. We didn't call them that. But they, these kind of stones that they set in place to say, what have we learned? As we've been building church, as we've been moving forward with what we sense God is saying, what kind of stones would we want to put in place to say, build with these? These are the good stones. And they're kind of like wise foundational stones. So I just want to take us quickly through these 4 things. So the first stone was this. They said, keep faithful to the call of God. Know your God-given vision and follow it. You are like a polished arrow, created to reach out to God's pre-prepared targets. And you know, when we think about where we're heading with the building, this is a pre-prepared target that God ordained for us. Not just actually a few years ago, not a few decades ago, but actually God has been preparing this for us since the beginning of time. This pre-prepared target for us to aim at. But at the start of this, it says, keep faithful to the call. And I think that is such an obvious thing in some ways, but such a good reminder, because it is so easy to fall away from the things that God has called us to. You know, I believe that God has a plan for each of us as individuals, that He is destined for us. But actually, some will remain faithful with that call and some won't. And I think it's so good to be reminded of that, but reminded of a God who calls us, who invites us, and says, follow me, follow this way. In Ephesians 2 verse 10 it says, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. You may not be aware of it tonight, but God has a plan for you. He has a plan for your life. And if you ever have days where you feel like life lacks meaning, or maybe you feel confused about your future, you need to know today that the God that we serve has a plan for you. And he prepared it in advance. The second thing was this: God always responds to our steps of faith when we are guided by him. God always responds to our steps of faith when we are guided by him. And in Hebrews 11 verse 6 it says, without faith it is impossible to please God. You know, I'm so pleased that we are taking steps of faith together as a church as we go forward. And actually, in doing that, we please God. Because God wants us to trust in him. You know, we sang that in a song just a little while ago about trusting in him, about putting our life and building our life on him because we trust him. And there was a moment in our extension in the building project which required a bit of trust. So some of you will know the technical term for these poles. I'm going to call them poles unless anyone corrects me.
Acros.
That was the word the builders used. Acros. Yeah, okay. There you go, you heard it here. That's what they are. This was the moment before the builders were taking out this external wall. And this external wall is a load-bearing wall, and it was holding up our house. So this is the moment that requires a lot of trust in the acros. It requires a lot of trust in those. And they don't look like they're doing much. There's just a bit of plank of wood going across the ceiling there. And they just go from ceiling to floor with some tension, just holding up the house. So this was a scary moment when that wall came down completely and all that was left were these poles holding up the house. And so the builder said to me, you need to trust me with this. How are you going to be with it? You know, are you okay about it? And I was like, yeah, I'm fine. And he was checking in with me because he's had people who couldn't sleep at night, knowing that just those things were holding up their house and that the whole supporting wall had gone. This is what required trust. And sometimes in our lives, it can be like this, where the things that maybe were propping us up, supporting us, as part of the old thing that God was doing, or maybe an old season in our life, there were certain things that were propping us up, holding us up. But there are times where God wants to move us forward into a new space, where actually he wants us to trust him, to knock out maybe some of the walls that were load-bearing walls in our lives, and what he was doing in the old season. When he wants to do a new thing, will we trust him to knock away some of those load-bearing walls, those things that we feel keep us safe? And I was so encouraged when we were in a trustees meeting just a few weeks ago, where we sat around and we had the question, we've been talking around this question for a long time, but can we do this? And we were looking at the amount of investment needed into St Barnabas, and we were looking at all the tables and finance sheets and Excel spreadsheets all across the table, and we're like, can we do this? Should we do this? This is going to require faith. And I remember Lois, she said, if it didn't require faith, I'm not interested. And those words really stuck with me, because actually without faith it is impossible to please God. If we've heard God on something, then we need to trust him. A little bit like this kind of situation. Trust him when it feels like some of the security or the load-bearing walls are being taken away. I think it gets God's attention when, in these moments, we put our trust in him and him alone. And I wonder if today we might feel, it's a bit of a challenge, do we feel like we don't have God's attention at the moment in our lives? And I wonder if we're praying risky enough prayers. Do we just pray safe prayers? Do we not allow our prayers to take us beyond what we have right now? Would we be willing to knock down some walls in our lives that maybe are keeping us safe? You know, one of the most dangerous prayers I prayed was, break my heart for what breaks yours. It's a risky prayer that moves us towards things that move God's heart. And this is the third thing. Always be ready to embrace the new things that God is doing. This will keep your creative spirit alive. Now, as a church, we've always, I think we've always had a lot of creatives in our church, and so therefore we've written some of our own songs over the years. We've written a lot of songs over the years. So that element of creativity has always been something that's been very much alive in our church. And I like how we're willing to respond and react to different things in a creative way, or come at things from a different angle. And as I read those verses before in Isaiah, where it says, see, I'm doing a new thing. But, you know, if we're honest in church life, and even for a creative church like us, it can be so much easier to keep doing the same thing. You know, how frustrating it can be when our routines are upset. You know, when something happens out of the ordinary and causes us to go a different way to work. You know, that kind of, just causes us to do something different. And we saw it in COVID. We had to respond, we had to react. But actually, although we would always choose to go a more comfortable route than the safe route. But you see, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again, it can be it can be a bad thing actually, because it can cause us to drift from our mission, it can cause us to drift from the things that God is calling us to. And just to give you an example of this, we see it really clearly in retail and in business. So if you consider, many of you will know Blockbuster videos. Do you remember Blockbuster videos? In the 1990s, there was one on literally every single high street, wasn't there? I can remember one in Netherton, where I grew up. I can remember my code going to get the VHS cassette, and the DVD 7001 was my code. And I would go down and hire the latest film. But you see, Blockbuster, they were the global leaders in their field. They were worth $8.4 billion. But by 2010, they were losing $1 billion a year. So this business that had been on every single high street, it soon disappeared. But you see, their mission was to be the global lead in video rental. But they carried on using their model of VHS and DVDs and bricks and mortar. But you know what makes this story even more interesting is that in the year 2000, a company that you also may have heard of, Netflix, heard of those? So they met with the CEO of Blockbuster, and they presented this new idea that they would like to run the online presence for Blockbuster. They said, you know, we've got this idea where you can stream movies. And the CEO of Blockbuster at the time, apparently, as the legendary story goes, is that he had to hold in his laugh in that meeting. He didn't just refuse to change, but he actually found it a very hilarious concept. Now, of course, we are not a business, we're not into video rental, but we are the church. And our mission is even more important because it's God's mission and it's all about people. And so in this season, I think we need to adopt a posture that is always being ready to embrace the new things that God is doing, because this will keep your creative spirit alive. And I would also say it will also keep us on track with our mission. But that's next week. We're looking at mission next week. And I guess there's a challenge with this. What would we be willing to change in order for our children or our grandchildren to thrive and not just to survive in their faith, in life? What would you be willing to do? Now, I think the answer to that question, having a couple of kids of my own, is almost anything. We would do almost anything, wouldn't we? For those that we love, to see them thrive. So what are we willing to do? I think this is my challenge. What would we be willing to do, change? What new thing would we be willing to embrace for the sake of the next generation? And then the fourth thing is this: keep facing outwards, and generosity will continue to flow through you. Now, at this point, I'd like a few volunteers. I've not prepped anyone, okay? So I'm just going to wake us all up. Finn's busy making notes. So Steve, Linda, you're both there. Ruth, great. If you could come here for me. Maybe one more. Derek, you're laughing. You thought that was hilarious, didn't you? Come on. Okay. Now, very often when we are building church, this is what it can look like. Okay, so what I want you to do, I want you to all hold hands. Sorry about this, not very COVID compliant, is it, in these days? Hold hands. Yeah, this is how we build community, right? I mean, we often say, when it comes to connect groups, that actually connect groups are even better than Sundays in many ways, because circles are better than rows when it comes to discussing the Bible, when it comes to growing in our faith, to actually be able to face each other, talk to each other in a smaller context like this. This is what builds community right here. But here on this point it says, keep facing outwards and generosity will continue to flow through you. You see what happens is when these guys are here like this, new people can come along, and in September we're going to have a lot of new people come along, and they're going to be new people we've never met before, new people from our community, and they're going to be like, hi, 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 hi. And we need to be people that aren't people who have our backs to the new folks, but actually we need to be a church that build, and if you'd like to turn outwards, hold hands. Fantastic. This is a great way of being generous, open, and allowing generosity to flow through you. Because if you're facing towards the new people that are coming through, you're ready, you're responsive, you're seeing a need, you're seeing a person who's trying to get your attention. And this is how we can be generous. You see, that other circle is very closed, whereas this is an open posture. And this is a fantastic way of building a community. Thank you both. Thank you all four of you. I was thinking through, if there was one thing for September that I would love us to do, and that would be to find out a way that we can connect to the new folks that will be coming through on the Sunday as we gather for our service, but also on the community day as well. How do we develop a way, a system of not just having hundreds of people pass through our doors and then out the other side, but actually how can we build a place where people want to stay, where people want to hand over their contact details and say, I want to know more. What I've experienced here is changing my life. What I've experienced here I don't want to let go of. I want to experience more of it. And so that's something that I'll be working on and will be working on as we get closer to September. But I've asked Nick if she would just read the open house vision. So just before we give our tithes and offerings and our vision offering as well, I just want Nick to just come and remind us of this open house vision, of what we dream of, want to see in our future. We've caught glimpses of this. We've caught glimpses of it for the last 10 years or so. But we would love to see this even more so.
Open House Vision, September 2009. I see a house with many extensions. I see a garden with many soils and plants. I see an open house, a place where people bleed but are healed. A place where people cry but are comforted. A place where people laugh and share memories. A place where people plan adventures and expeditions. A place where Jesus is Lord and is the centre to all our conversations. A place where tunes and words inspire. A place where people are built up and renewed. I see workers who have passion and compassion, who serve at great cost and delight in the giving of themselves and their treasures. I see people coming to catch a glimpse of Jesus and to meet with our miracle-working God. I see lives transformed, bodies healed, and minds made whole. I see a home where sinners feel welcome and strangers find friends. I see a house where Jesus gets the glory, a house that is known by his name and not ours, a house that brings light to darkness and overcomes evil. Do you want to accept the challenge to build? It will cost you everything except your joy and your peace. And in the building there will be loss and sacrifice, but there will be excitement, contentment and fulfillment. In the building your life will be changed and you will see the glory of God. In the building you will be despised and rejected, but in the building we will see many saved, healed and delivered.